Dr. Puran Brijmahan, CocoaPOP Project Director, UTT, Professor Dwyer Naran Singh, President, UTT, Mr. James Rawle, Chairman, Cocoa Industry Board, Jamaica, Ulrich Thiessen, EU Delegation Representative, and all protocol observed. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and members of the media, thank you for coming today. I'm going to talk to you in the capacity of the role I had in this project as chairman of the CocoaPOP External Advisory Board. And I'm glad to see that we're all on the same page, more or less. Some things got lost in translation between cocoa and coconut. Could have been worse. It could have been cocaine. We talk to people about cocoa, they think cocaine. This is great. There's more money in that still, I think. But no, we stay on the legitimate side here. And I'll share with you in the next few minutes my personal views on this project and as it relates to other things too. So today marks the end of three and a half years of a project, EU project. And as the president of UTT said, that we hope that this work will continue in some shape or form, because it must translate from research in the lab or in the institutions to impact the farmers and stakeholders in the field and in the marketplace. That's the core of what I try to do. I'm a change agent. So today marks the end of a chapter, if you like, but not the end of the book. And when I do these projects and I think of them, I think at the end of the project, I think it's useful to look back at where we came from, where we started out, so that we get the whole synopsis. So, 3.5 years is hard to capture, but I'll do it very briefly. I understand that we're having a morning break shortly, so I don't want to keep you from your tea and coffee. But my relationship with UTT dates back to when Professor Thompson was there. As Professor Bridgerhan said, we did our first project for UTT back in 2005. And that was also a 3-year project, out of which came the forum. And it was the first project UTT had that was supported by EU funding, so we thank, again, the EU for that money. And it was really to kick off a transformation across the Caribbean of a cocoa sector that was really archaic. I mean, if you close your eyes and you walked into a cocoa plantation and open them up, you think you're back in the 18th, 19th century. That's the reality. And things have moved on in the world. So that, what was a commodity back in the 18th, 19th century, really has no chance of commercial success in Trinidad, much less Jamaica, in the 21st century, unless you radically transform the model, what you're doing here. You've got to add value. Productivity was alluded to earlier by Professor Naran Singh, and it's correct because we're still doing a fraction of what could be possible theoretically in the field. We could multiply that by 4 or 5 times what is developed in the field just by the bean level. Much less the value add, which is an economic factor of 10 or 15 times. So once you get into that mode of increased productivity and increased value add, then farmers can grow cocoa beans commercially and do something with it in the region. That's the vision. So about 5 years ago, I met with Dr. Phil Stevenson at EU Brussels meeting. They have their annual sessions, and at the time, I recall, bumblebees or honeybees were in crisis in the northern hemisphere. They were dying out, and these are the unpaid workers of the agricultural sector. And without a bumblebee, you don't have much of a food sector. And it struck me that, with climatic change occurring everywhere in the world, we're going to have a similar issue with pollination probably of cocoa and other crops. Insect vectors are the unpaid workers. They're very important. We know that climate is changing. You have more floods, you have more droughts, you have fires, adverse weather. So we best serve for food security to understand how these insects work. So let's research it. And when I looked into it further, we found that the last research was done in the 1970s. That's the last research that we did on insect vector pollination in the Caribbean on cocoa, and that's nearly 50 years ago. So I thought, well, there's a need there. It got to be important, right? So we developed the bid and submitted it, and it was successful. And so the project was born, and here we are 5 years later. Because when you write the bid, you develop it, implement it, and so on, you're talking about a 5-year time span, and that's a long period of time, at least in my lifetime. So, we have to think now proactively of what happens next, and we'll come to that this afternoon. So we're aware of the many useful accomplishments of the project, and I'm summarizing some of these here, and the details will be elaborated on later. The project managed to bring partners together from different parts of the world. So this probably never happened without EU funding. University of Greenwich, NRI in the UK, working with CABI, which is pan-regional, working with UTT, and the Cocoa Industry Board of Jamaica. Bringing all these partners together, Professor said it earlier, diversity plus inclusion equals innovation. And we had certain objectives to achieve, rather ambitious, because when I write projects, I like them to be ambitious and to implement change. But the work led to greater understanding and knowledge of what we didn't know, as well as what we were looking to find out. And so we had some innovations, which you'll hear about later, on how to capture these midges. And we also had them DNA cataloged. So it's the beginning of a journey, which has to continue. And all partners learned and benefited from something new, because University of Greenwich, I understand, we're new to cocoa. There was a sector that they weren't familiar with, and UTT needed some capacity building in areas of insect research and pollination and so on. So it was for everybody's benefit bringing the partners together. We had capacity building occurring in the process, knowledge sharing, and practical actions occurred as well, because the insectary that's at the University UTT in Waterloo, we began to refurbish and rehabilitate that to some extent. So we're going back in time, if you like, but we're getting to get more studies on insect behavior, in this case, as it relates to cocoa. The trick now, as I said, is to translate that knowledge into commercial benefits for the wider stakeholder community, some of which are in the room here today. What I found interesting, though, was that the paucity of research and expertise in this area was alarming to me. Like I said, the last research was back in the 70s. And the universities, although some work had been done at the student level, it wasn't being publicized or promoted. So it might be somewhere lying down on a shelf somewhere collecting dust. And it may not be the final article, but at least it's work that was done. And we need to know what is there. It was interesting to me that we had, in the end, somebody coming from Australia. Cocoa doesn't grow in Australia. And this lady came from Australia, and she helped the project with midge cultivation. That was one of the big challenges. How do you get this insect to continue to live so you can study its life cycle and then hopefully potentially breed it artificially? That's part of the goal that we had. Because if you can do that, then you can reintroduce it after floods or droughts to compensate nature, in a process of intervention. So we found some interesting things happening out there in Australia, which hopefully we'll share with you later. But, to my mind, research for research's sake is not enough. And we have a center here, very well acknowledged globally as leading in cocoa. And don't get me wrong, it does some great work. But the problem was the research they were doing was either not immediately relevant or beneficial to the stakeholders. So although they existed in the Caribbean and Trinidad, the cocoa sector went into decline for 20 years while they were still doing research. So we have to change that. We have to have a connectivity between research and action that's relevant and beneficial. I also found there were some attitudes there, not present company, but that one institution can do it all. There's no real need for others to collaborate with. That's false, it's wrong. People must be aware of their limitations and their competencies and play in strengths and work in genuine partnership. And I won't go into details, but that's it for now. In that area, and also there was what I would call political interference. And interestingly, both parties have been removed from office in Jamaica and in Trinidad. But I don't know if that's a message to politicians, but basically, the work is enough as it is than to have interference put in the place of ongoing useful activity that's occurring. Okay? So what I would appeal to those in position of authority, there needs to be a greater urgency to act. Not just research, but translate that into action. So I think we're all on the same page, as I said earlier, making that happen, go to the next stages of concluding what we've started here through other funding, and then implementing it in the field, hopefully in parallel. I want to thank all who have worked in the project and contributed to the achievements that we've heard about and we'll hear more about. UTT, NRI, University of Greenwich, same entity there, CABI, Cocoa Industry Board, specifically to mention Mr. James Rawle, Mr. Leroy Gray, who's traveled today, Garth Mullings from Jamaica, and in Trinidad, Dr. Bridgemahan, Euphemia, Kazo, behind the scenes working away, making sure that the funders are happy with accounting for the money that we spent and complying with the legislation there. And Professor Narayan Singh for concluding the project successfully on behalf of UTT, because he came into office as this was starting out, I believe. So thank you all for coming. I hope you find the revelations of our research useful and will spark further ideas for what happens next, because that's also something I believe that we need to have. Contributions from people in the field, the farmers, stakeholders in the marketplace. You have to help direct the research, where it goes, how it's used, and how it's commercialized. So thank you all for your time.